In the marble lobby of the Hallcrest Grand Hotel, head of security Dale Fenwick physically grabs and drags an older black janitor, Elijah Moore, toward the front doors, accusing him of not belonging in the building in front of a stunned crowd of guests. We go back to Elijah's small apartment that morning, revealing he has quietly worked as a night janitor at this very hotel chain for 3 years under an assumed low profile, carrying an old photograph of the rundown motel he first built decades ago with his own hands. The Hallcrest Grand's lobby is introduced in cinematic detail. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, wealthy guests checking in for a major industry conference, and a rigid hierarchy where uniforms determine who belongs and who doesn't. Elijah is stopped and questioned while quietly repairing a broken fixture near the executive elevator, accused of trespassing despite his valid staff badge, and mocked by Fenwick in front of arriving conference guests. Flashback beats reveal Fenwick has a pattern of harassing lower-level staff, especially older black employees, while favoring younger, more presentable hires, with HR complaints quietly dismissed by a manager loyal to him. A young front desk clerk named Talia, who has quietly admired Elijah's kindness and work ethic for years, tries to intervene and hints that this has happened before to people who couldn't fight back. Fenwick physically grabs Elijah's arm and drags him toward the exit, tearing his uniform and calling for additional security to have him permanently banned from the property. We learn Elijah's badge number connects to an old employment file buried under a legal name change, and that hotel corporate's general counsel has already been alerted by Talia through an anonymous ownership hotline. The chain's current CEO, attending the very conference underway in the hotel's ballroom, is informed mid-event and walks out personally, the crowd falling silent as he crosses the lobby. The CEO reveals that Elijah Moore is the hotel chain's original founder, who built the first property from nothing decades earlier and has spent the last 3 years quietly working the night shift to understand how his company truly treats its people, backed by original incorporation documents and his true legal identity. Fenwick's excuses collapse under the weight of the revelation. His employment is terminated on the spot, and the manager who buried previous complaints faces removal as well. Months later, Elijah formally reforms the company's treatment of frontline staff. Talia is promoted, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. Get your hands off that fixture and get out of my lobby before I have you arrested for trespassing. The words echoed sharply across the polished marble floor of the Hallcrest Grand's grand lobby, cutting through the low murmur of arriving conference guests. Dale Fenwick, the hotel's head of security, gripped the arm of an older black man in a gray janitor's uniform, pulling him roughly away from a small maintenance panel near the executive elevator bank. Elijah Moore, 68 years old, didn't resist. He simply looked down at the hand clamped around his forearm, then up at Fenwick's flushed, self-satisfied face, his own expression calm despite the obvious pain of the grip. "Sir, I have a valid staff badge," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady even as Fenwick pulled him another step toward the front doors. "I work the night maintenance shift. I was simply repairing a loose panel before the morning rush." "I don't care what story you've got," Fenwick snapped, loud enough that several well-dressed guests checking in for the hotel's annual hospitality leadership conference turned to watch. "I've never seen you before, and you don't look like you belong anywhere near this elevator bank." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing, the kind of silence people offer when a uniformed authority figure seems certain of himself and no one wants to be the one to interrupt. A young front desk clerk near the check-in counter froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening in unmistakable alarm. "My badge is right here," Elijah said, lifting his free hand slowly to show the laminated card clipped to his uniform. "If you'll simply scan it, you'll see." "I don't need to scan anything," Fenwick interrupted, tightening his grip and pulling Elijah another step toward the revolving doors. "I know trouble when I see it, and I'm not about to let it wander around during the biggest event of the year." Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't struggle. He simply let himself be pulled, his eyes calm, almost patient, as though he had weathered far worse storms in his lifetime than one man's misplaced certainty. They had no idea who they were about to drag out of that lobby, or how completely this single reckless decision was about to unravel everything Dale Fenwick believed he understood about his own authority. 6 hours earlier, in a modest one-bedroom apartment across town, Elijah Moore had sat at his small kitchen table before his overnight shift, holding a faded photograph he had looked at nearly every day for the past 40 years. The photograph showed a rundown roadside motel, its sign missing half its letters, a young version of Elijah standing proudly in front of it with a bucket of paint in one hand and a hand-lettered grand opening banner draped behind him. That crumbling little motel, purchased with every dollar Elijah had saved from a decade of construction work, had been the very first property of what would eventually become the Hallcrest hospitality chain. 41 hotels across 11 states, built one property, one careful decision, and one exhausting year at a time. Elijah had built that company from nothing, working alongside his late wife, Corinne, who had managed the front desk of that very first motel, while he personally repaired every leaking pipe and broken window himself, unable to afford outside help in those earliest years. Corinne had passed away 3 years ago, and in the quiet, aching months that followed, Elijah had found himself increasingly troubled by something he couldn't shake, a growing sense, filtered through corporate reports and quarterly earnings calls, that the company he'd built to treat people with dignity had drifted, somewhere along the way, into something colder. So he had done something no one on his board of directors knew about. He had quietly stepped back from public leadership, hired a discreet interim CEO to manage daily operations, legally simplified his name on paper to Elijah Moore, a version of his own middle names, unrecognizable to almost anyone outside his closest circle, and taken a position as a night maintenance worker at one of his own flagship hotels, determined to see, with his own eyes, how his company actually treated the people who kept it running. He carried Corinne's photograph in his badge holder every single night, a quiet reminder of exactly why this mattered. He kept a small worn notebook, too, tucked in his toolkit, filled with brief handwritten observations from his 3 years undercover. Small moments of kindness he'd witnessed among staff, and quieter notes about places where the company he loved had clearly lost its way. He intended someday to turn those pages into real, lasting change. He simply hadn't expected that day to arrive quite like this. He had no idea, locking his apartment door that evening for another ordinary overnight shift, that in a few short hours, everything he had quietly built his second life around was about to collide, publicly and irreversibly, with the very culture he had come there to understand. The Hallcrest Grand's lobby had been designed to announce success from the moment guests walked through its revolving doors. Marble floors stretched beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off gold-trimmed columns and a sweeping staircase that curved toward the hotel's grand ballroom. A 20-foot floral arrangement stood at the center of the lobby, refreshed daily, a quiet testament to the kind of budget that only truly successful hotels could justify. That particular week, the Hallcrest Grand hosted the hospitality industry's largest annual leadership conference, drawing hotel executives, investors, and franchise owners from across the country. The lobby buzzed with tailored suits, leather portfolios, and the low hum of important conversations, everyone moving with the practiced confidence of people accustomed to being taken seriously the moment they walked into a room. Uniformed staff moved efficiently through the space, bellhops managing luggage carts, front desk clerks checking in VIP guests with practiced smiles, and security personnel stationed discreetly near entrances, tasked with maintaining the seamless, polished atmosphere the Hallcrest brand had built its reputation on. It was a place built entirely around visible hierarchy, who wore which uniform, who carried which title, who moved freely through the space, and who was expected to remain quietly in the background, seen only when something needed fixing and otherwise invisible to the guests paying premium rates to stay there. Elijah Moore had worked the overnight shift at this very property for 3 years, quietly repairing fixtures, replacing burnt-out light bulbs, and maintaining the elevator systems that carried thousands of guests through the building each week, entirely unnoticed by the very executives gathering that morning to discuss the future of an industry he himself had helped build decades earlier. He had no idea how quickly this glittering, self-important lobby was about to fall completely silent around him. The trouble had started innocently enough. A guest had reported a loose access panel near the executive elevator bank the previous evening, and Elijah, arriving for his overnight shift, had taken the assignment himself, quietly setting up his small toolkit and beginning the careful repair work well before the morning conference crowd arrived. He had been midway through tightening the panel's hinges when Dale Fenwick rounded the corner, immediately zeroing in on him with an expression of open suspicion. "Who authorized you to be back here?" Fenwick had demanded, before Elijah had even fully turned around. "I'm on the overnight maintenance team," Elijah had explained calmly, gesturing toward his uniform and badge. "There was a report of a loose panel near this elevator. I'm simply finishing the repair before the morning rush begins." "I've worked security at this hotel for 4 years," Fenwick had said, crossing his arms. "I know every maintenance worker on staff, and I don't recognize you. I was hired about 3 years ago," Elijah had said patiently. "I mostly work overnight, so our paths likely haven't crossed." Fenwick had scoffed audibly at that, glancing Elijah up and down with obvious skepticism. "Convenient story. I think you need to come with me while we verify that badge." It was at that moment, as Fenwick reached out and grabbed Elijah's arm rather than simply scanning the badge clipped clearly to his uniform, that the confrontation escalated beyond a routine misunderstanding into something far uglier. What Fenwick didn't notice, too focused on asserting his own authority, was that a young front desk clerk named Talia Reyes had gone very still behind the check-in counter, her eyes fixed on the unfolding scene with an expression that wasn't confusion at all. It was recognition and something close to dread. That small detail, a young clerk's stillness near the front desk, would become the first crack in Dale Fenwick's entire morning. This was not the first time Dale Fenwick had treated a member of the hotel's frontline staff this way, and it would not have been the last had the wrong person not happened to be the one he grabbed that morning. 8 months earlier, an older black housekeeper named Yvonne Price had been aggressively questioned by Fenwick for moving too slowly through the executive floor hallway, an incident that ended with her filing a formal complaint after he threatened to have her badge deactivated over a delay caused entirely by a guest late checkout. For months before that, a young Latino bellhop named Diego Fuentes had been accused by Fenwick of theft after a guest misplaced a laptop bag, an accusation later proven completely false once hotel cameras confirmed the guest had simply left the bag in a taxi. Diego received no apology, only a quiet note in his file about attitude concerns raised during the investigation. And just 6 weeks ago, a longtime maintenance worker named Curtis Banks had been publicly reprimanded by Fenwick in front of arriving guests for wearing a slightly wrinkled uniform, despite having worked a documented double shift the previous night covering for a colleague's family emergency. Each of these complaints had been formally filed with the hotel's Human Resources Department. Each had landed on the desk of a general manager named Patrick Doyle, who had personally recruited Fenwick years earlier and consistently closed these complaints with minimal review, citing insufficient documentation despite security footage that told a very different story each time. Each of these employees had walked away from their encounters with Fenwick believing there was little point in escalating further, assuming a security chief's word would always outweigh their own. None of them knew that a fourth person, quietly mopping floors just a few departments away, was about to receive the exact same treatment and possess the exact standing needed to finally end the pattern for good. A hotel doesn't announce when a manager's personal loyalty has quietly protected a pattern of cruelty toward the people who keep it running. It simply continues operating smoothly until someone with enough standing finally happens to walk through the very lobby where that pattern has been unfolding. Elijah Moore, still calmly explaining himself as Fenwick's grip tightened around his arm, was about to become exactly that person. Talia Reyes had worked the front desk at the Hallcrest Grand for just over 2 years, and in that time, she had come to genuinely admire Elijah Moore, the quiet, kind-night maintenance worker who always greeted her warmly during shift changes and had once spent an entire unpaid hour helping her jumpstart her car in the employee parking lot during a freezing winter storm. She had noticed, quietly, that Elijah carried himself with a dignity that seemed almost out of place for someone in his position. a calm, unhurried confidence that never wavered no matter how staff members above him spoke to him. She had never understood exactly why, only that something about him felt different from anyone else she'd worked with. Watching Fenwick grip his arm now, dragging him toward the lobby doors in front of dozens of arriving conference guests, something in Talia finally overrode the caution that had kept her silent through every previous incident she'd witnessed. She stepped quickly around the check-in counter. "Dale, wait," she said, her voice trembling slightly but audible enough to carry. "That's Elijah. He works nights. I've seen his badge dozens of times." "Stay out of this, Talia," Fenwick snapped, not even slowing his stride. "This isn't your department." Talia hesitated only a moment before pulling out her phone, her fingers moving quickly. She had heard, months earlier during a training session, about an anonymous corporate ownership hotline meant for serious concerns that couldn't be resolved through normal management channels. A hotline she had never expected to actually need. "I tried reporting Dale before about what happened with Yvonne," she murmured, mostly to herself, as she typed. Nobody listened then. Maybe someone will listen now. She didn't know it yet, but the message she sent in that trembling, urgent moment was about to reach someone with far more authority than any general manager Fenwick had ever answered to. Fenwick's grip tightened further as he pulled Elijah past the 20-foot floral arrangement toward the hotel's revolving front doors, his voice rising now, performing his authority loudly for the gathering crowd of conference attendees. "I want this man permanently banned from the property," he announced into his radio, loud enough that dozens of guests turned to watch. "Possible trespassing, possible theft attempt near the executive elevators. I need additional security to the main lobby immediately." Elijah's uniform tore slightly at the shoulder seam as Fenwick yanked him forward. Though his expression remained remarkably composed, his voice steady even as the physical indignity of the moment played out in front of a room full of strangers. "Sir, you're making a very serious mistake," he said quietly. "I would strongly advise you to simply scan my badge before this goes any further." "I don't take advice from trespassers," Fenwick snapped, refusing to slow down even as two additional security officers jogged over from opposite ends of the lobby, uncertain but responding to the urgency in his voice. A small crowd had gathered now near the revolving doors, phones beginning to rise, several guests murmuring uncomfortably to each other about the disturbing scene unfolding in front of them. One older guest, a woman attending the conference as a longtime franchise owner, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me, has anyone actually checked his identification?" "Ma'am, please step back," Fenwick said dismissively, still gripping Elijah's arm. But Fenwick had no idea that Talia's urgent message had already reached the desk of the hotel chain's general counsel. Forwarded within minutes to the office of the company's current CEO, a woman attending the very leadership conference underway just 2 floors above the lobby at that exact moment. The call had already been made, and it was about to reach someone whose presence would change absolutely everything. What Dale Fenwick did not know, what almost no one gathered in that lobby knew, was that the Hallcrest Hospitality chain's anonymous ownership hotline had been established years earlier specifically at Elijah's own insistence, back when he still ran the company publicly, precisely because he never wanted frontline staff to feel powerless against exactly this kind of situation. The hotline routed directly and immediately to the company's general counsel, a longtime attorney named Patricia Ames, who had personally worked alongside Elijah for over 15 years, and remained one of only 3 people who knew the full truth about his current employment at the Hallcrest Grand. Patricia had frozen the moment Talia's message arrived, describing an older black maintenance worker being forcibly removed from the lobby of the flagship hotel. She didn't need clarification. She knew, instantly, exactly who was being described. She placed an immediate call to current CEO Renata Cole, the trusted interim leader Elijah had personally selected 3 years earlier, who was at that very moment seated in the hotel's ballroom 2 floors above, delivering opening remarks to the assembled conference of hospitality executives. "Renata," Patricia said, her voice tight with urgency the moment the call connected, "security is dragging Elijah out of the main lobby right now. You need to get down there immediately." Renata Cole did not hesitate. She excused herself mid-sentence in front of 400 conference attendees, informed her assistant to hold the room, and moved quickly toward the ballroom's side exit, her mind racing through everything Elijah had built, everything he had quietly sacrificed to understand his own company more deeply, and the bitter irony that it had led to this exact moment in his own flagship lobby. The truth about who Elijah Moore really was had been sitting quietly, patiently, for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment to matter. The ballroom side doors opened with a soft, mechanical hiss that, on any ordinary morning, no one in the lobby below would have noticed at all. This time, as Renata Cole crossed the mezzanine balcony and descended the sweeping staircase into the main lobby, her expression tight with barely controlled urgency, heads began turning throughout the crowded space. She was instantly recognizable to nearly everyone present. The current, well-respected CEO of the entire Hallcrest hospitality chain. Her photograph featured prominently on conference materials scattered across the lobby's welcome tables. Fenwick, still gripping Elijah's torn uniform near the revolving doors, glanced up and registered her approach with visible confusion, his grip loosening only slightly. "Ms. Cole, I'm handling a trespassing situation. I'll have this cleared up shortly." "Let go of him," Renata said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent lobby, every syllable carrying an authority the entire room instantly recognized. Fenwick hesitated, glancing between his CEO and the older man he'd been dragging toward the doors, his confidence visibly faltering for the first time all morning. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand who this." "I understand exactly who this is," Renata said, crossing the remaining distance and stopping directly in front of Elijah, her expression shifting instantly from urgency to something far more tender. "Mr. Moore, I'm so deeply sorry. Are you all right?" The crowd's confused murmur rippled into stunned silence as Renata reached out and gently steadied Elijah's torn uniform sleeve, her voice trembling now with an emotion that clearly went far beyond standard corporate courtesy. Fenwick's face had begun to drain of color. The word "Mr. Moore," spoken with such obvious reverence by his own CEO, landing like a warning he hadn't yet fully understood. "Dale," Renata said, turning slowly to face him directly, her voice quiet but carrying easily across the silent lobby. "Do you have any idea who you just dragged through this building?" "Ma'am, he didn't have proper identification. I was simply," Fenwick started. He had a valid staff badge clipped to his uniform the entire time, Talia said, stepping forward from behind the check-in counter, her voice shaking but clear. "I told him that myself. He refused to check it." Renata nodded toward Talia gratefully before turning back to address the stunned crowd directly. "This is Elijah Moore," she said, her voice carrying the full weight of the moment. 41 years ago, he built this company's very first property with his own hands. A small roadside motel he personally repaired night after night because he couldn't afford outside help. He grew that single property into the 41 hotels that make up this entire chain, including the very ballroom upstairs where I was just speaking to 400 of you about the values this company was founded on. A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the crowd. Patricia Ames arrived moments later, carrying a folder containing Elijah's original incorporation documents and legal name change records, setting them on the nearby concierge desk for anyone who needed proof of what Renata had just announced. He has spent the last 3 years working the overnight maintenance shift at this very hotel, Renata continued, specifically because he wanted to personally understand how his own company treats the people who keep it running. This morning, he found his answer. "I didn't know," Fenwick stammered, his voice breaking with dawning horror. "If someone had told me." "He tried to tell you," Elijah said quietly, speaking for the first time since Renata's arrival, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I offered you my badge 3 times. You refused to look at it because you had already decided the moment you saw me exactly who I was." Fenwick's excuses came quickly now, tumbling over each other, all his earlier authority dissolving in front of the very crowd he had performed for just minutes earlier. "I was just doing my job," he said, "protecting the property during a major event. That's not misconduct, that's..." That's exactly the pattern this company has ignored for far too long, Patricia Ames said, opening her folder to reveal 3 separate formal complaints filed against Fenwick over the past year, each one closed without proper investigation by General Manager Patrick Doyle, whose personal loyalty to Fenwick had quietly protected him through every previous incident. Patrick has been notified as well, Renata said. This isn't simply about what happened this morning, Dale. This is about a pattern this hotel allowed to continue because the people you hurt never had a platform loud enough to be believed. Fenwick looked around the lobby at the stunned conference guests still watching, phones lowered now in a kind of respectful silence. At Talia, who would not look away this time. At Elijah, standing with quiet, unshaken dignity despite the torn uniform still hanging from his shoulder. He looked, finally, at Renata, and something in his face collapsed entirely under the weight of what he had just done. Please, he said, quieter now, all his earlier certainty gone. I have a family. This job is everything I have. So does Talia, Renata said evenly. So did Yvonne, and Diego, and Curtis. Every one of them treated exactly like this over the past year, while their complaints disappeared into a file nobody bothered to review. You didn't just make a mistake this morning, Dale. You finally got caught making the same mistake you've been making for a very long time. Security escorted Fenwick from the building minutes later, his termination effective immediately, his badge and radio surrendered at the very doors he had once dragged Elijah toward without a second thought. 8 months later, the Hallcrest Grand's lobby buzzed with a very different kind of energy. The company's newly launched Frontline Dignity Initiative, a sweeping policy overhaul developed personally by Elijah Moore, who had finally stepped back into public leadership after 3 quiet years of learning exactly what his company needed to become. General Manager Patrick Doyle was formally removed from his position following a full review of the buried complaints against Fenwick, replaced by a leadership structure that now required every formal staff complaint to be reviewed by an independent panel rather than a single manager with personal loyalties. Talia Reyes, whose courage in that lobby had ultimately mattered more than she ever imagined, was promoted to a newly created role overseeing frontline employee advocacy across the entire chain. Personally selected by Elijah himself, who told her simply, "You did what almost no one else in that room was willing to do. This company needs more people like you in positions where it matters." Yvonne Price, Diego Fuentes, and Curtis Banks each received formal apologies and back pay adjustment for the mistreatment they had endured, along with permanent seats on the company's new employee advisory board, ensuring frontline voices would never again disappear into an ignored complaint file. Elijah returned to his overnight maintenance shifts occasionally still, though now everyone in the building knew exactly who he was, greeting him each night, not with suspicion, but with the quiet respect of people who finally understood what real leadership looked like. He kept Corinne's photograph in his badge holder still, a reminder, he said, of the 2 people who had once painted a broken motel sign together, believing it could become something far greater than either of them imagined. At the grand reopening ceremony marking the launch of the Frontline Dignity Initiative, Elijah stood in the very lobby where he had once been dragged toward the doors, holding the same faded photograph of that first crumbling motel, and told the gathered staff and press simply, "A company is never really built by the person whose name sits on the paperwork. It's built every single day by the people who show up quietly and do the work nobody else notices. I forgot that for a while, running things from distance. I don't intend to forget it again." Have you ever watched someone dismiss a person's worth simply because of the uniform they wore or the job they were doing? What would you have done in that lobby? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.